The morning of February 8, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Frederick Warder stood in the cramped conning tower of USS Seawolf, somewhere in the Makassar Strait between Borneo and Celebes. Through the hydrophone headset clamped over his ears, he could hear the distinctive throb of diesel engines. Japanese convoy. Multiple ships. Exactly what he'd been hunting for since Pearl Harbor had turned the Pacific into a shooting gallery 2 months earlier. But Warder wasn't looking through the periscope. He couldn't. Navy doctrine, drilled into every submarine commander since the mid-1930s, was crystal clear. Periscopes were death traps. One glimpse of that slender tube cutting through the water and enemy destroyers would be on you like wolves. The pre-war tactical manuals were explicit about this. Modern anti-submarine warfare had evolved too far. Japanese destroyers carried sonar. Their lookouts were trained. Their depth charges were devastating. Exposing a periscope, in daylight, was essentially broadcasting your position and begging to be killed. So Warder did what he'd been trained to do. He relied on sound. His sonar operator called out bearings. The plotting team worked furiously, translating acoustic data into target solutions. Range, speed, angle on the bow, all calculated from the subtle variations in propeller noise picked up by Seawolf's sophisticated hydrophone arrays. The United States Navy had spent millions of dollars developing these systems. American submarines carried the most advanced underwater listening equipment in the world, paired with torpedo data computers that could solve firing solutions with mathematical precision that no other nation could match. Warder ordered tubes 1 through 4 ready. The sonar operator gave him a final bearing. The TDC operator confirmed the solution. Fire. 4 Mark 14 torpedoes left Seawolf's forward tubes, their own propellers adding to the symphony of mechanical noise filling the strait. Warder counted seconds. At this range, roughly 1,800 yards, the torpedoes should hit in about 90 seconds. He waited. The crew waited. Nothing. No explosion. No breaking up noises. Just the continued throb of those Japanese diesel engines, growing fainter as the convoy steamed away, completely unaware that an American submarine had just tried and failed to kill them. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Warder surfaced after dark, defeated and furious. He'd done everything right. He'd followed doctrine perfectly. He'd used the equipment exactly as designed. And he'd missed. Again. This was Seawolf's 3rd war patrol since the war began, and the results were becoming a grim pattern. Plenty of targets, plenty of opportunities, almost no hits. The same story was playing out across the entire Pacific submarine force in those first desperate months of 1942. The problem wasn't courage. American submariners were charging into combat with the kind of aggression that should have been devastating the Japanese merchant fleet. The problem wasn't the submarines themselves. The Gato-class and Tambor-class fleet boats were technological marvels, 311 feet of American engineering designed specifically for long-range Pacific operations. They could make 20 knots on the surface, dive in under a minute, and carry enough fuel and supplies for patrols lasting 2 months or more. The problem was doctrine, and nobody wanted to admit it. The United States Navy had spent the entire interwar period, from 1919 to 1941, developing what it believed was the future of submarine warfare. That future was built on one fundamental assumption. Modern anti-submarine technology had made traditional periscope attacks obsolete. British studies from the late 1930s had been terrifying. They predicted that 75% of submarines attempting to penetrate an escort screen using periscopes would be detected. Of those detected, 50% would be sunk. During the first year of World War II in the Atlantic, the Royal Navy had actually achieved those numbers against German U-boats. The British were killing submarines at an appalling rate. American naval planners looked at those statistics and made what seemed like a rational decision. Periscopes were too dangerous. Submarines needed a different approach. The answer, they decided, was technology. Sonar-based attacks. Firing solutions calculated from acoustic bearings alone. Keep the submarine deep, keep it hidden, and let physics and mathematics do the work. The Navy invested heavily in this vision. Every fleet submarine commissioned after 1938 came equipped with state-of-the-art passive sonar systems. The JP hydrophone array could detect surface ships at ranges exceeding 10,000 yards under ideal conditions. The QC sonar provided active ranging when needed, though doctrine discouraged its use because it revealed the submarine's position. Most impressively, American submarines carried the Mark I torpedo data computer, a mechanical analog computer that could integrate target bearing, range, speed, and course, then calculate the proper gyro angle for each torpedo in real time. It was a genuine technological marvel, more sophisticated than anything the Japanese, British, or Germans possessed. On paper, the system was perfect. In practice, it was failing catastrophically. The fundamental flaw was simple but devastating. Sonar bearings weren't accurate enough. Passive hydrophones could tell you roughly where a target was, but roughly wasn't good enough when you were trying to hit a ship traveling at 12 knots from 1,800 yards away with a torpedo that took 90 seconds to reach the target. Small errors in initial bearing translated into massive misses at the RECHO, point of intercept. A target bearing estimation that was off by just 2 degrees at 1,800 yards meant the torpedo would miss by over 60 feet. Most merchant ships were only 60 to 80 feet wide. There was no margin for error. Active sonar could provide better ranging data, but using it was considered suicidal. A single ping broadcast your position to every ship within miles. Japanese escorts might not have sophisticated sonar themselves, but they could hear American submarines pinging, and they knew exactly what it meant. Depth charges would follow shortly after. Range estimation from passive sonar alone was even worse than bearing accuracy. The sound of propellers gave you direction, but converting that into distance required educated guessing based on sound intensity, which varied wildly depending on water conditions, thermal layers, and the specific acoustic signature of each ship. The torpedo data computer could only work with the data it received. Garbage in, garbage out. Feed it imprecise bearings and questionable ranges, and it would dutifully calculate a firing solution that sent torpedoes into empty ocean while Japanese freighters sailed on, untouched. But acknowledging this would mean acknowledging that the Navy had spent 2 decades and millions of dollars developing a doctrine that didn't work. That was a hard admission to make, especially in the opening months of a war where every sinking mattered. So the official line in early 1942 was that the problem wasn't the tactics. The problem was the torpedoes. And to be fair, the Mark XIV torpedo was genuinely defective. The magnetic exploder didn't work properly. The depth-keeping mechanism ran 11 feet deeper than set. The contact exploder had a design flaw that caused it to fail on perpendicular hits. These were real problems that really did cause real failures. But they weren't the only problems, and focusing exclusively on torpedo defects allowed the Navy to avoid confronting the larger tactical failure. Submarine commanders were caught in an impossible situation. They'd been trained for years to fight one way. Their orders told them to fight that way. Their equipment was designed to support that way. But that way wasn't working, and men were coming back from patrols with nearly full torpedo loads, having fired at target after target without achieving hits. The frustration was building throughout the submarine force. Officers would gather in wardrooms at Pearl Harbor or Fremantle or Brisbane, comparing notes, sharing stories, looking for answers that nobody seemed to have. And then, in January of 1943, something changed. USS Wahoo returned to Pearl Harbor from her 3rd war patrol under a new commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Dudley Walker Morton. Morton had taken command in late December of 42, replacing a captain who'd been too cautious, too conservative, too willing to follow doctrine even when doctrine wasn't working. Morton's 3rd patrol had been different, dramatically different. Wahoo's battle flag showed 9 Japanese ships sunk, totaling over 30,000 tons. No other submarine had achieved numbers even close to that in a single patrol. When Morton came ashore, other submarine commanders wanted to know his secret. What new tactic had he discovered? What technological advantage had he exploited? Morton's answer was simple, almost absurd in its straightforwardness. He'd looked through the periscope. He'd abandoned sonar-based attacks almost entirely. He'd taken Wahoo to periscope depth, put his executive officer Richard O'Kane on the scope, and let O'Kane call out precise visual bearings, ranges estimated from masthead heights, and angle on the bow measurements made with his own eyes. Then Morton had manoeuvred Wahoo into point-blank range, sometimes as close as 800 yards, and fired torpedoes that couldn't miss because the targets were so close that even torpedo defects couldn't save them. It was heresy. It violated everything the Navy had been teaching for 2 decades. It ignored all those British studies about detection rates and kill probabilities. It threw away millions of dollars in sonar technology in favor of the Mark I eyeball and basic trigonometry. And it worked. Morton had the sinkings to prove it. The question facing the rest of the submarine force was whether they had the courage to follow his example, to abandon the doctrine they'd been taught and trust what Morton had discovered. That periscopes weren't death traps, that Japanese lookouts weren't as effective as British studies suggested. That getting close, dangerously close, was better than hiding deep and hoping math would save you. The revolution in American submarine warfare was about to begin, and it would transform the Pacific campaign in ways nobody in 1939 could have predicted. To understand why periscope attacks seemed so dangerous, you need to understand what submarine commanders had been taught to fear. The pre-war tactical doctrine wasn't based on paranoia or cowardice. It was based on what appeared to be solid evidence that the nature of naval warfare had fundamentally changed. And at the center of that change was a technology that the Allies had perfected during World War I, active sonar. The British called it ASDIC, short for Anti-Submarine Division X, the Royal Navy department that had developed it. Americans called it sonar, an acronym for sound navigation and ranging. Both terms describe the same basic principle: send out a pulse of sound underwater. Listen for echoes bouncing back from solid objects. Calculate range and bearing from the echo characteristics. Simple in concept, revolutionary in practice. For the first time in naval history, surface ships could detect submerged submarines at distances measured in thousands of yards rather than hundreds of feet. Pre-war exercises seemed to confirm sonar's devastating effectiveness. British trials in the late 1930s showed that destroyers equipped with ASDIC could detect submerged submarines with shocking consistency. Once detected, the submarine was essentially doomed. The destroyer would close in, tracking the submarine with continuous sonar pings, then drop patterns of depth charges set to explode at the submarine's estimated depth. The submarine couldn't outrun a destroyer. It couldn't dive deep enough to escape. It could try to evade, but sonar made evasion nearly impossible. American observers watched these exercises and drew what seemed like obvious conclusions. Modern submarines couldn't operate the way World War I submarines had operated. The old tactics of running submerged at periscope depth, stalking targets visually, closing to torpedo range while exposed, those tactics would get you killed against a competent enemy with working sonar. The future belonged to submarines that remained deep, that relied on passive sonar to find targets, that fired from maximum range to minimize exposure time, and that dove immediately after firing to escape the inevitable counterattack. The problem was that peacetime exercises and wartime reality were 2 entirely different environments. In an exercise, everyone knew a submarine was present. That was the whole point. Destroyers could dedicate their full attention to finding it. Lookouts scanned the water, specifically looking for periscope feathers, that telltale wisp of disturbed water trailing behind a periscope cutting through the surface. Sonar operators listened intently for the distinctive sound signature of a submerged submarine. The entire exercise was designed around submarine detection. In actual combat, especially in the vast expanses of the Pacific Ocean, the situation was completely different. A Japanese merchant convoy crossing from Truk to Rabaul wasn't conducting an anti-submarine exercise. The lookouts were watching for navigation hazards, scanning for aircraft, maintaining station-keeping with other ships in the convoy. They might glance at the water occasionally, but they weren't staring at every square yard of ocean surface with the focused intensity of exercise participants who knew exactly what they were looking for. The psychological difference was enormous. In an exercise, seeing a periscope was expected. In combat, it was a shock, a moment of recognition that required mental processing time before action could follow. That delay, measured in seconds or even minutes, was often enough for an aggressive submarine commander to complete his attack and dive to safety before the escorts could respond effectively. But nobody in the pre-war Navy had fully grasped this distinction. The doctrine had been written based on exercise results, and exercise results suggested periscope attacks were suicidal. There was another factor that pre-war planners had failed to appreciate. The quality of anti-submarine forces varied dramatically between navies. The British Royal Navy in the Atlantic was fighting for national survival. They devoted enormous resources to anti-submarine warfare, developing not just sonar technology but also tactics, training programs, and dedicated escort vessels designed specifically for submarine hunting. They'd learned from World War I and refined their doctrine over 2 decades. When a German U-boat exposed its periscope to a British escort group in 1941, it was facing one of the most sophisticated anti-submarine warfare systems in human history. The Japanese Navy in the Pacific was nothing like that. Japan had built its naval doctrine around surface combat, around carrier strikes and battleship engagements and destroyer torpedo attacks. Anti-submarine warfare was a secondary concern, almost an afterthought. Japanese destroyers were designed for fleet actions, not convoy escort. They were fast, heavily armed with torpedoes and guns, and optimized for night, fighting against other surface combatants. Their sonar equipment was generally inferior to American or British systems. Their depth charges often lacked variable depth settings. Most critically, their doctrine and training emphasized offensive surface action over defensive escort duty. When a Japanese destroyer was assigned to convoy escort, it was performing a mission it hadn't been primarily designed for, using tactics that hadn't been thoroughly developed, with equipment that wasn't as sophisticated as what the Allies possessed. Japanese lookouts weren't trained to the same standard as British lookouts. Japanese sonar operators didn't have the same level of experience. The entire anti-submarine warfare system was less effective, less aggressive, less dangerous than what the pre-war studies had assumed submarines would face. American submariners began discovering this gap between doctrine and reality almost immediately after the war started. But the lesson took time to sink in. Early war patrols were conducted according to pre-war doctrine because that's what commanders knew, what they'd been trained to do, what their orders specified. The poor results were attributed to torpedo defects, which were real, rather than tactical failures, which were also real but less comfortable to acknowledge. Lieutenant Commander Frederick Warder on USS Seawolf was one of the first to start questioning the doctrine. After his February 42 patrol in the Makassar Strait, where sonar-based attacks had failed repeatedly, Warder began experimenting cautiously with periscope observations. Not full attacks, not yet, but quick looks to verify what his sonar was telling him. What he discovered was illuminating and disturbing. The sonar bearings were often off by significant margins. Ranges estimated from sound intensity bore little relationship to actual ranges measured visually through the periscope. The torpedo data computer was solving perfect firing solutions for targets that weren't where the sonar said they were. On Seawolf's 4th patrol in April and May of 42, Warder started relying more heavily on periscope observations. He'd still use sonar for initial detection, but once he'd found a target, he'd come to periscope depth for the approach and attack. The improvement in accuracy was immediate and dramatic. His torpedo hit rate climbed from less than 20% to over 40%. More importantly, he noticed something that contradicted everything he'd been taught. Japanese lookouts rarely spotted his periscope. Even when they did, the escort's response was often slow, confused, ineffective. Other commanders were making similar discoveries. Lieutenant Commander Willis Lent on USS Triton found that periscope attacks in daylight, which doctrine said were impossible, were actually quite feasible if you were careful about exposure time. Keep the periscope up for only a few seconds at a time. Take quick looks, duck down, process the information, come back up for another look. The narrow attack periscope head, only about 2.5 inches in diameter, left a minimal wake. Japanese lookouts simply weren't spotting it with any consistency. Commander Reuben Whitaker on USS S-44 took the experimentation even further. He conducted periscope attacks in restricted waters near Guadalcanal, where Japanese air patrols were heavy and destroyer presence was constant. Conditions that should have been absolutely suicidal according to pre-war doctrine. He sank multiple ships and escaped without significant counterattack. The Japanese escorts knew there was a submarine in the area after the torpedoes hit, but by then it was too late. The attacks were over, and S-44 was diving to safety before the escorts could organize an effective response. The evidence was accumulating throughout 1942, but it remained anecdotal, scattered across dozens of individual patrol reports. There was no systematic analysis, no official recognition that the fundamental doctrine might be wrong. Bureau of Ships in Washington was focused on fixing the torpedo problems, which were indeed severe. ComSub PAC headquarters at Pearl Harbor was focused on getting more submarines into the war zone and dealing with the immediate crisis of trying to slow the Japanese advance across the Pacific. Nobody had time to step back and look at the bigger picture of how submarines were actually being employed and whether that employment matched what was actually working in combat. Then came Dudley Morton and USS Wahoo, and everything changed. Morton wasn't cautiously experimenting with periscope attacks, while still maintaining sonar-based approaches as a backup. He was abandoning the old doctrine entirely and building something new from the ground up. His innovation went beyond just looking through the periscope. He restructured the entire command arrangement inside Wahoo to optimize for visual attacks. In traditional submarine doctrine, the captain stood at the periscope during attacks. He called out bearings, estimated ranges, watched the target, tracked torpedo runs, and simultaneously tried to con the submarine into the best firing position. It was too much for one person to do effectively. Morton recognized this after attending prospective commanding officer school, where instructors who could focus solely on conning the submarine consistently arrived at better attack positions more quickly than student commanders who were trying to do everything at once. Morton's solution was radical. He put his executive officer, Lieutenant Richard O'Kane, at the periscope. O'Kane would handle all the observation and measurement tasks. He'd call out bearings, estimate ranges using masthead heights and stadimeter readings, track angle on the bow, monitor torpedo runs, watch for escorts. Morton would stand back in the conning tower, listening to O'Kane's reports, visualizing the entire tactical situation in his head, and making the command decisions: where to maneuver, Wahoo, when to fire, how to evade afterwards. This division of labor meant both officers could focus on what they did best. O'Kane could concentrate on getting precise targeting information. Morton could concentrate on tactics and strategy. The system worked because Morton trusted O'Kane completely, and O'Kane trusted that Morton would use the information he provided effectively. It was a level of delegation and mutual confidence that was rare in submarine operations, where captains traditionally maintained direct control of every aspect of an attack. On Wahoo's third war patrol in January and February of '43, Morton and O'Kane put this system through its ultimate test. They took Wahoo into Wewak Harbour on the northern coast of New Guinea, a defended Japanese anchorage where multiple destroyers were moored and patrol craft prowled constantly. Pre-war doctrine would have said penetrating such a harbour was suicide. Morton navigated, through uncharted reefs at 3 knots, brought Wahoo to periscope depth in restricted waters, where one depth charge could drive them onto the rocks, and O'Kane spotted a 4-ship convoy preparing to depart. Morton positioned Wahoo across the convoy's exit route and waited. When the convoy emerged, O'Kane called out precise bearings and ranges. Morton maneuvered Wahoo into point-blank position. They fired a spread of torpedoes and systematically destroyed the convoy. The Japanese escorts never located Wahoo before she slipped back out through the reef passages and escaped into open ocean. 9 ships sunk in one patrol. It was a record that no submarine had approached in the entire first year of the war. When Wahoo returned to Pearl Harbor, Admiral Charles Lockwood, Commander Submarine Force Pacific, personally came aboard to debrief Morton. Lockwood was a pragmatist who cared about results more than doctrine. He'd been watching submarine performance with growing frustration throughout 42. Too many patrols with minimal results, too many commanders coming back with excuses about torpedo failures and missed opportunities. Morton's results demanded explanation. Morton laid it out simply. Stop hiding deep and hoping sonar will work. Come to periscope depth. Get close to the target. Use your eyes instead of your ears. Accept that some escorts might detect you, but recognize that most won't. And even if they do, you'll probably complete your attack and escape before they can respond effectively. The safety that deep submergence promised was illusory. The danger that periscope depth represented was exaggerated. The key was aggression, combined with precise information, and you couldn't get precise information from hydrophones alone. Lockwood listened, looked at the sinking reports, and made a decision that would transform the Pacific submarine campaign. He wouldn't order commanders to use periscope attacks. That would require officially admitting the old doctrine was wrong, which would involve bureaucratic complications with Washington. Instead, he did something more effective. He made Morton a teacher. Whenever a new submarine captain reported to Pearl Harbor for his first patrol assignment, Lockwood sent him to talk to Morton. He encouraged successful commanders like Morton, Warder, and others who'd adopted periscope tactics to share their methods informally with less successful commanders. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Most importantly, Lockwood stopped relieving commanders based solely on whether they followed doctrine. He started relieving commanders based on results. If you came back from 3 patrols with minimal sinkings, you were done, regardless of whether you'd followed every procedure perfectly. If you came back with substantial sinkings using unorthodox methods, Lockwood would defend you against any criticism from Washington. The message was clear. Find what works and do it. The Navy will figure out how to officially approve it later. Throughout 1943, periscope attacks spread through the submarine force like a virus, passed from commander to commander, from crew to crew, refined through trial and error in combat conditions. Each successful patrol provided more data points. Each failed sonar-based attack reinforced the lesson. By mid-43, the majority of American submarine commanders in the Pacific had abandoned blind sonar firing almost entirely. They were hunting at periscope depth, closing to ranges that would have been considered insanely dangerous 2 years earlier, and sinking Japanese ships at rates that were finally starting to match pre-war expectations. The torpedo problems were being fixed simultaneously. The depth-running issue was corrected in mid-42. The magnetic exploder was disabled in mid-43. The contact exploder was fixed by late 43. But fixing the torpedoes alone wouldn't have been enough. You still had to hit the target for the torpedo to work, and sonar-based attacks simply couldn't provide the accuracy needed for consistent hits. Periscope attacks could. The combination of working torpedoes and accurate targeting finally unleashed the submarine force's full potential. The Japanese never really adapted. Their anti-submarine doctrine and training remained focused on what they expected submarines to do, which was based on their own submarine doctrine and what they assumed all submarines operated similarly. Japanese submarines tended to operate conservatively, avoiding unnecessary exposure, staying deep when threatened. Japanese planners assumed American submarines would do the same. They kept setting depth charges for relatively shallow depths. They kept training lookouts according to pre-war standards. They kept assigning destroyers to convoy escort without providing specialized anti-submarine warfare training. By late 1943, American submarines were operating with near impunity in waters the Japanese considered secure. The kill rate was climbing month by month. November 43 saw over 200,000 tons of Japanese shipping sunk by submarines. December was even higher. The learning curve that should have happened in 1942 was finally manifesting in 43, and the results were catastrophic for Japan's maritime logistics. The irony was profound. The United States Navy had spent 2 decades and enormous resources developing a submarine warfare doctrine based on hiding and technology. When that doctrine failed in combat, individual submarine commanders had abandoned it in favor of methods that were actually much simpler and much older. Look through the periscope, get close to the target. Fire at point-blank range. It was how submarines had fought in World War I. It was how common sense suggested submarines should fight. But it had taken 2 years of war and hundreds of lost opportunities before the Navy officially acknowledged what its best commanders had discovered through desperate necessity. The transformation wasn't complete yet. Some commanders remained cautious, still uncomfortable with periscope exposure, still trying to make sonar-based attacks work, but they were being steadily replaced by younger, more aggressive officers who'd learned from Morton and the other pioneers. By 1944, the Pacific submarine force would be an entirely different weapon than it had been in 42. Aggressive instead of cautious, visual instead of acoustic, close range instead of long range, and devastatingly effective. The Japanese merchant marine, which had started the war with over 6 million tons of shipping, was about to discover exactly how effective periscope attacks could be when executed by commanders who'd finally learned to ignore the doctrine that didn't work and embrace the tactics that did. By January of 1944, the transformation of American submarine tactics from theoretical doctrine to practical combat methodology was essentially complete. What had begun as isolated experimentation by a handful of aggressive commanders had become standard operating procedure across the Pacific submarine force. The results were visible in every harbour from Pearl Harbor to Fremantle. Submarines were returning with battle flags, showing more kills per patrol than entire divisions had achieved in early 42. The tonnage statistics told the story in cold mathematical terms. Japanese merchant marine losses to submarines had climbed from roughly 180,000 tons in all of 1942 to over 1.8 million tons in 1943. The rate was accelerating. Lieutenant Commander Richard O'Kane received command of USS Tang in October of 1943. He'd learned everything he knew about submarine warfare from Dudley Morton aboard Wahoo, and he intended to apply those lessons with even greater precision and aggression than his mentor had achieved. Tang was brand new, a Balao-class submarine that incorporated all the latest improvements: better radar, better sonar, stronger hull construction, more reliable diesel engines. But the most important equipment Tang carried was the tactical doctrine that O'Kane had helped develop. The knowledge that periscope attacks at close range were not just survivable, but devastatingly effective. Tang departed Pearl Harbor for her first war patrol in January of 44 with orders to operate in the Caroline Islands region. By the time she returned to Pearl Harbor in mid-March, she'd sunk 5 Japanese ships totaling over 20,000 tons. O'Kane's patrol report detailed attack after attack conducted at periscope depth, often at ranges of 1,500 yards or less, sometimes in broad daylight, frequently in waters where Japanese air patrols were active. The escorts rarely detected Tang before the torpedoes hit. When they did detect her, their counterattacks were ineffective. O'Kane would take Tang deep, evade for a few hours, then return to periscope depth and resume hunting. The pattern repeated across the submarine force. USS Harder under Commander Samuel Dealey was sinking Japanese destroyers with such regularity that Japanese Naval Command began routing convoys around areas where Harder was believed to be operating. USS Flasher under Commander Reuben Whitaker had become so proficient at periscope attacks that her torpedo hit rate exceeded 50%, nearly double the fleet average. USS Silversides under Commander John Coy was conducting surface attacks at night using radar for targeting, another tactical innovation that combined new technology with aggressive employment. What made 1944 different from 43 wasn't just that individual commanders were achieving spectacular results. It was that the Average submarine was now performing at levels that only the best boats had reached the previous year. The learning had spread throughout the force. New commanders arriving in the Pacific already knew that periscope attacks were the preferred method. They'd heard the stories, read the patrol reports, talked to the veterans. They didn't need to rediscover the tactics through trial and error. They could start their first patrol already employing methods that had been proven in combat by dozens of predecessors. The tactical revolution had become institutionalized. The submarine school at New London, Connecticut, revised its curriculum to emphasize periscope attacks. The prospective commanding officer school at Pearl Harbor, which Morton had attended and criticized for its over-reliance on sonar doctrine, restructured its training around visual targeting and close-range engagements. New construction submarines were being designed with improved periscope optics as a priority rather than an afterthought. The Bureau of Ships was developing radar-equipped periscopes that combined visual observation with electronic ranging, merging the best of both technologies. For Japan, the consequences were approaching catastrophic. The Japanese economy had always been critically dependent on maritime shipping. The home islands possessed minimal natural resources. Oil came from the Dutch East Indies and Borneo. Iron ore came from China and Manchuria. Rice came from Korea and Taiwan. Rubber came from Malaya. Every raw material that fed Japanese industry and sustained Japanese military operations had to be transported by ship across sea lanes that were now infested with American submarines operating at peak effectiveness. In January of 1944, American submarines sank over 250,000 tons of Japanese merchant shipping. February was slightly lower due to weather conditions limiting operations. March jumped to 300,000 tons. April reached 350,000 tons. The trend was unmistakable and unsustainable. Japan's shipyards couldn't replace losses at anything approaching these rates. Japanese merchant marine tonnage was in absolute decline, dropping month by month as submarines sank ships faster than yards could build replacements. The Japanese Navy tried to respond. Convoy sizes increased. Escort ratios improved. Some destroyers received better anti-submarine warfare training. Depth charges were modified to include deeper settings after American Congressman Andrew May stupidly revealed in a press conference that Japanese depth charges weren't set deep enough, forcing submarine commanders to publicly correct him and inadvertently confirming to Japanese intelligence that American submarines were routinely operating below 300 feet. But these measures were too little, too late, and often poorly implemented. Japanese anti-submarine doctrine remained fundamentally flawed. They still assumed submarines would behave conservatively, would attack from maximum range, would prioritize their own safety over aggression. They never fully grasped that American submarine commanders were deliberately taking risks that Japanese doctrine considered unacceptable. Penetrating defended harbors, attacking in shallow water, surfacing at night in the middle of convoy formations. These were things Japanese submariners wouldn't do, so Japanese anti-submarine planners didn't adequately prepare for defending against them. The USS Tang's second war patrol illustrated exactly how far American submarine tactics had evolved from pre-war doctrine. In April and May of '44, O'Kane took Tang into the East China Sea and the Formosa Strait, waters that Japan considered relatively secure due to their proximity to Japanese air bases and naval facilities. O'Kane operated Tang at periscope depth throughout most of the patrol, sometimes within sight of the Chinese coast, occasionally close enough to Formosa to see buildings through the periscope. Over 5 weeks, Tang encountered 12 separate convoys or groups of independent ships. He sank 10 confirmed ships, totaling over 40,000 tons, making it one of the most successful patrols of the entire war. What made these numbers even more remarkable was the consistency. O'Kane wasn't getting lucky with occasional spectacular attacks. He was methodically finding targets, closing to optimal firing range, usually between 1,000 and 2,000 yards, making precise observations through the periscope, firing accurate torpedo spreads, and sinking ships with mechanical efficiency. His patrol report became required reading for every submarine commander in the Pacific. It demonstrated that periscope attacks weren't just viable, they were the most reliable method for achieving consistent results. O'Kane detailed his techniques with unusual precision: how long to keep the periscope exposed for each observation, typically 5 to 10 seconds, how to estimate range using masthead heights and stadometer readings, how to judge angle on the bow visually, how to select the optimal aim point on different ship types, how to time firing so torpedoes arrived just as the target reached the ideal position. Other commanders studied O'Kane's methods and refined them further. Commander Eugene Fluckey on USS Barb developed a technique for night periscope attacks using moonlight and starlight for targeting, allowing visual precision without requiring surface running that might expose the submarine to radar detection. Commander Lawson Ramage on USS Parche perfected surface attacks in convoy formations, racing between ships at flank speed while firing torpedoes at multiple targets before diving to evade escorts. Commander George Street on USS Tirante became expert at attacking in restricted waters, where conventional doctrine said submarines shouldn't operate. The tactical creativity was flourishing precisely because commanders had abandoned the rigid pre-war doctrine that specified exactly how attacks should be conducted. Once the straitjacket of official procedure was removed, individual commanders could experiment, innovate, and share what worked. The submarine force had become a genuine learning organization, where best practices spread rapidly and continuous improvement was expected rather than discouraged. By mid-1944, American submarines were sinking Japanese ships at rates that exceeded even optimistic pre-war projections. The Pacific Submarine Force, which had struggled through all of 42 and much of 43, had become the most effective submarine force in naval history. The learning curve had been brutal and expensive. Valuable months had been wasted. Opportunities had been missed. But once the force finally abandoned doctrine that didn't work and embraced tactics that did, the results were overwhelming. The human cost of this learning process was substantial but largely invisible in official statistics. 48 American submarines were lost during World War II, most of them before the tactical revolution was complete. Some were lost to depth charges that might have been avoided with better tactics. Some were lost to mines or aircraft or surface action. Some simply disappeared, their fate unknown, their crews entombed somewhere on the Pacific floor, with no one left alive to explain what went wrong. USS Wahoo, Dudley Morton's boat, the submarine that had pioneered so many of the tactics that eventually became standard, was lost in October of 43 during her 7th war patrol. Morton had taken Wahoo into the Sea of Japan, penetrating through La Perouse Strait in what was considered one of the most dangerous submarine missions of the war. Wahoo sank several ships, then attempted to exit through the same strait. Japanese patrol aircraft spotted her surfaced in the strait and attacked with depth charges. Wahoo went down with all hands, including Morton and 79 crew members. The boat that had proven periscope attacks could work, that had shown aggressive tactics could succeed, was gone. The irony was bitter. Morton had survived dozens of attacks by demonstrating that American submarines could operate more aggressively than doctrine suggested. He'd taken risks that other commanders avoided and proven those risks were manageable. Then he'd taken one risk too many in waters too confined and too heavily patrolled, and Wahoo had paid the price. His loss was mourned throughout the submarine force. He'd been an inspiration, a teacher, a leader who'd shown others how to fight effectively. But war consumes even its most talented practitioners, and submarine warfare was particularly unforgiving of mistakes. Other pioneers of the tactical revolution survived to see their methods vindicated. Frederick Warder, who'd begun questioning sonar doctrine early in 42, completed 6 successful war patrols as a commanding officer before being rotated to staff duty. Samuel Dealey on USS Harder continued his aggressive tactics through 1944, sinking Japanese destroyers with such consistency that he became known as the Destroyer Killer. He received the Medal of Honor for actions in June of 44. 2 months later, Harder was lost with all hands during her 6th patrol, caught by Japanese escorts in shallow water off the Philippines, where evasion was impossible. Richard O'Kane and USS Tang continued their devastating patrols through 1944. Tang's third patrol in June and July targeted the Yellow Sea, waters the Japanese had considered relatively safe due to shallow depths that limited submarine maneuverability. O'Kane ignored the limitations and sank 13 ships. Tang's fourth patrol in September and October was even more successful, with 13 ships sunk in the Formosa Strait and the East China Sea. O'Kane had become the most successful submarine commander in the Pacific, surpassing even Morton's record. On October 24, 44, during Tang's fifth patrol, O'Kane fired his last torpedo at a Japanese transport. The torpedo malfunctioned, ran in a circle, and struck Tang herself. The explosion was catastrophic. The stern was destroyed instantly. Tang sank in 180 feet of water. 78 men died. Only 9 survived, including O'Kane, who spent the rest of the war in a Japanese prisoner-of-war camp. When he was finally liberated in August of 45, O'Kane learned he'd been awarded the Medal of Honor for Tang's final patrol, where he'd sunk 13 ships in the span of 5 days before the circular run ended his war. The loss of Tang highlighted a truth that often got lost in the statistics and the celebration of tactical success. Submarine warfare was inherently dangerous regardless of how skilled the commander or how proven the tactics. Mechanical failures, equipment malfunctions, navigation errors, enemy luck, any of these could kill a submarine and its crew. The tactical revolution had made American submarines more effective, had increased their survival rates against enemy action, had allowed them to sink more ships while taking fewer losses. But it hadn't made submarine duty safe. It never would be safe. By the time the war ended in August of 1945, American submarines had sunk over 1,200 Japanese merchant ships and warships, totaling approximately 5 million tons. That represented more than half of all Japanese maritime losses during the war. The submarine force had achieved this despite representing less than 2% of U.S. Navy personnel. The efficiency was staggering. No other military force in World War II achieved comparable results with such limited resources. The cost had been 48 submarines and 3,500 officers and men lost. The submarine force had the highest casualty rate of any branch of the American military, nearly 22% killed in action. But those losses had purchased something invaluable. They'd strangled the Japanese economy, cut the supply lines that sustained Japanese military operations, and made it impossible for Japan to continue the war, even if they'd wanted to. By early 1945, Japanese oil imports had dropped to less than 10% of 1941 levels. Iron ore imports had collapsed. Food imports were insufficient to feed the civilian population. The home islands were starving and freezing, cut off from their empire by an invisible blockade of American submarines. The tactical revolution that began with a few aggressive commanders, ignoring doctrine and trusting their periscopes, had evolved into the most effective maritime interdiction campaign in history. What made it work wasn't superior technology, though American submarines and torpedoes were eventually quite good. What made it work wasn't superior numbers, though by late in the war, the US had a substantial submarine fleet. What made it work was the willingness of commanders to abandon tactics that didn't work, to experiment with methods that violated official doctrine, and to share what they learned so others could benefit from their experience. The pre-war doctrine that emphasized sonar-based attacks from maximum range had been built on reasonable assumptions that proved incorrect in practice. British studies had suggested periscope attacks were suicidal, but those studies were based on fighting the Royal Navy in the Atlantic, not the Japanese Navy in the Pacific. The effectiveness of enemy anti-submarine warfare varied dramatically between opponents, and pre-war planners hadn't accounted for that variation. They'd assumed all enemies would be as capable as the British, and they'd been wrong. The lesson extended beyond submarine warfare. Military doctrine developed in peacetime, based on exercises and studies, and theoretical analysis, often fails when confronted with actual combat conditions. Doctrine is necessary. It provides a starting point, a baseline set of procedures that work reasonably well in most circumstances, But doctrine must be flexible enough to adapt when reality diverges from expectations. Organizations that can adapt quickly, that can learn from failure and disseminate success rapidly, survive and prevail. Organizations that rigidly enforce doctrine regardless of results are destroyed. The Pacific Submarine Force in World War II was ultimately an example of successful organizational adaptation. The initial doctrine failed. Individual commanders discovered alternatives through trial and error. The organization recognized success when it appeared and promoted it throughout the force. Less successful commanders were removed. More successful commanders were studied and emulated. Within 18 months, the entire force had transformed itself from a relatively ineffective, weapon-executing flawed doctrine into a devastatingly effective force employing proven tactics. That transformation didn't happen through top-down orders from Washington. It happened through bottom-up innovation from combat commanders that was recognized and supported by intermediate leadership like Admiral Lockwood. The physical legacy of the submarine campaign remained visible in Pacific waters for decades after the war. Hundreds of Japanese merchant ships lay on the ocean floor, testament to the effectiveness of periscope attacks conducted by aggressive commanders who'd learned to ignore peacetime theories about how submarine warfare should work. The wrecks stretched from the Philippines to Japan, from the East China Sea to the South Pacific, marking the sea lanes where Japan's maritime empire had bled to death one ship at a time. The doctrinal legacy influenced submarine warfare for the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. Post-war submarine design emphasized periscope capabilities. Training programs emphasized visual attack methods. The hard-won lessons of 1943 and 44 were codified into new doctrine that replaced the failed pre-war theories. When nuclear submarines arrived in the 1950s, they carried forward the tactical principles that Morton, O'Kane, Dealey, and others had discovered. Get close to the target. Use precise observation. Accept calculated risks. Trust aggressive action over cautious preservation. The commanders who'd pioneered these tactics were honored in various ways. Morton received 4 Navy Crosses, the last posthumous. O'Kane received the Medal of Honor. Dealey received the Medal of Honor posthumously. Dozens of other submarine commanders received Navy Crosses, Silver Stars, and other decorations recognizing their combat achievements. Several had destroyers or submarines named after them in the post-war fleet. Their patrol reports became case studies in naval warfare, analyzed by generations of submarine officers learning their trade. But perhaps the most important legacy was the demonstrated proof that military organizations can learn and adapt even under the worst circumstances. The Pacific Submarine Force at the start of World War II was executing doctrine that didn't work, using tactics that produced minimal results and following procedures that their best commanders knew were flawed. Within 2 years, that same force had completely transformed itself through a combination of individual initiative, institutional flexibility, and leadership that valued results over conformity to failed doctrine. The transformation didn't happen smoothly or easily. Men died while the force was learning what worked. Opportunities were lost. Time was wasted. The learning curve was paid for in blood and sunken submarines and sailors who never came home. But the force did learn, and once it learned, it applied those lessons with devastating effectiveness. The Japanese merchant marine, which had seemed so powerful in 1941, was effectively destroyed by 1945, sunk by submarines that had finally figured out how to fight. Standing on the bridge of any American submarine in the Pacific in late 1944, you could see the result of that learning process. The tactics had been perfected. The torpedoes finally worked. The targeting procedures were precise. The aggressive doctrine had been proven in hundreds of successful attacks. What had seemed suicidally dangerous in 1941, using periscopes at close range in defended waters, had become routine. The fear had been replaced with confidence built on experience and success. The submarine commanders who took their boats out in those final months of the war knew exactly what they were doing. They knew how to find targets using radar and periscope searches. They knew how to close to optimal firing range without being detected. They knew how to make precise observations through the periscope. They knew how to shoot accurately. They knew how to evade counterattacks. They knew all of this because dozens of commanders before them had figured it out through trial and error and had shared what they'd learned. That knowledge, purchased at such terrible cost during the learning period of 42 and 43, had transformed the submarine force into a weapon of extraordinary effectiveness. The doctrine that had failed so completely in the war's opening months had been replaced with tactics that worked. The theoretical assumptions that proved incorrect in combat had been discarded in favor of methods validated by success. The organization had learned, adapted, and prevailed. The Japanese never really understood what had happened. Their post-war analysis of submarine warfare tended to focus on material factors: American technological superiority, greater numbers of submarines, better torpedoes. They largely missed the doctrinal transformation. The shift from sonar-based long-range attacks to periscope-based close-range engagements that had made American submarines so much more effective. They never fully grasped that American submarine commanders were operating according to principles that Japanese doctrine would have considered recklessly aggressive, taking risks that Japanese submariners were trained to avoid. That misunderstanding was itself instructive. Doctrine shapes how military organizations perceive threats and opportunities. Japanese anti-submarine doctrine assumed submarines would behave conservatively because that's how Japanese submarines behaved. When American submarines behaved differently, Japanese defenders struggled to adapt because their doctrine hadn't prepared them for aggressive submarine tactics. They were fighting the war they'd trained for, but their opponents were fighting a different war, one that American submariners had invented through necessity and refined through experience. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.